Okay, let's unpack this. When you look at the figures who don't just, participate in Silicon Valley, but who actively architect its future and, frankly, modern global geopolitics, few people cast a shadow as intellectually dense or uh, financially vast as Peter Thiel.
That's really where we have to start today. We are talking about a man who, as of recent estimates in December 2025, commands a net worth of about $27.5 billion. That puts him comfortably among the world's 100 wealthiest people.
Right.
But the mission here for you is to understand why the sources don't just call him a titan of industry. They frequently describe him as, and this is a quote, perhaps America's leading public intellectual today.
Or the intellectual architect of Silicon Valley's contemporary ethos. I've seen that one a lot.
Exactly.
So this deep dive, it isn't just a financial biography. I mean, it's an exploration of how radical philosophy translates into immense power and a very deliberate, systematic attempt to shape the future of civilization through tech and political disruption.
And our sources are extensive on this. They detail his journey from this really unusual, itinerant childhood in Africa to co-founding PayPal and Palantir, becoming the first outside investor in Facebook, and then dedicating his entire subsequent career to what he specifically calls hard tech.
And what's fascinating, and what we really want to get into, is that to genuinely grasp his corporate actions, I mean, whether it's his investments in defense or nuclear technology, or even his personal obsession with anti-aging research, you have to first dive into his foundational intellectual influences.
That's the key. We need to connect the dots between figures like, say, the philosopher René Girard and the political theorist Leo Strauss, and connect that all the way to the real-world companies he funds, the political candidates he backs, and even the political systems he's trying to build from scratch.
That is precisely our mission. We're looking for the operating code behind the money. So let's begin where all great origin stories must start, with the intellectual foundation of this radical contrarian. So Peter Thiel was born in Frankfurt, West Germany, back in 1967. His family moved to the U.S. when he was just one, but then his father, who was a chemical engineer, relocated the family to South Africa and then Southwest Africa.
Which is modern-day Namibia.
Exactly, Namibia. And this was right during the height of the apartheid era, between about 1971 and 1977.
So this was hardly a stable, rooted upbringing. I mean, the sources highlight that he changed elementary schools, well, was it 7 times?
7 times. And that nomadic early period, it seems to have left a profound philosophical mark on him, particularly his time in Swakopmund, Namibia.
Right. He recalled attending a German language school there that was, characterized by strict uniforms, intense regimentation, and they even used corporal punishment, like the old practice of striking students' hands with a ruler.
And he claimed that specific experience instilled a distaste for uniformity and regimentation, which in his own view fueled his early leanings toward libertarianism and this kind of absolute individualism.
A distaste for conformity that, later just blossoms into this full-scale critique of modern consensus and mass conformity.
Speaking of formative influences, the sources also note his early and continued passion for science fiction. They cite Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, and, maybe most revealingly, his reading J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings over 10 times as an adult.
And when you look at his empire, the influence of Tolkien is not just some curious literary footnote. It's the naming convention for his entire business ecosystem. It gives it this deliberately lasting, almost mythic quality.
So his key firms are named Palantir and Mithril Capital.
Both powerful artifacts from Tolkien's world. And what's truly insightful, and this is where you connect the philosophy to the finance, is that his inner circle often refers to the Founders Fund, his key venture firm, as the precious.
Wow, that's a fascinating link. It immediately draws on this idea of capital accumulation, not just as investment, but as something unique and fiercely guarded, like Sauron's One Ring.
Precisely. It reflects his later thesis in 0 to 1, where he argues that true wealth comes not from competition, but from establishing a monopoly, a unique, precious asset, something that has to be protected from imitators and, metaphorically, the masses who would destroy it. This language gives his pursuit of technological and financial dominance a deeply ethical, or at least a philosophical justification.
Okay, so after his high school excellence, he attends Stanford. And that's where his political identity seems to really crystallize in the late 1980s.
Yes. This period was marked by a real cultural war on campus. Stanford replaced its required Western culture program with a culture, ideas, and values course, which emphasized diversity and multiculturalism. And Thiel strongly rejected this institutional shift. He He co-founded the Stanford Review in 1987 as a sharp, conservative, and libertarian counterpoint to what he saw as academic decline.
And that review became, you could argue, his first major institutional achievement. It was so much more than a student paper. It rapidly became this critical...
Feeder network.
Exactly, a feeder network. The sources show it spawned what is now an influential Thiel ecosystem of over 300 individuals. We're talking early associates, former employees, current industry leaders who share his worldview and get funding or support from his network.
It proved that provocative ideas could attract and organize capability, which really became a defining strategy for his entire career.
And his time at Stanford also gave him these crucial intellectual mentors.
Right. He encountered René Girard, the French literary critic and philosopher whose mimetic theory deeply resonated with him. Girard's work focused on how human desire is mediated by others. We desire what others desire, which leads to this non-productive conflict. And ultimately, that conflict is resolved through the social mechanism of the scapegoat.
So how did that philosophical concept, mimetic desire and the scapegoat, how did that translate into his view of technology and business?
Well, it provided a framework for his distaste for competition. If competition is just two people desiring the same thing, mimetic rivalry, then it's a destructive waste of resources. His entire approach, which he later lays out in 0 to 1, is to avoid competition entirely and create monopolies, unique, non-mimetic solutions.
Yeah, interesting.
Furthermore, Girard's ideas about the necessary scapegoat to restore social peace also informed Thiel's Christian views and, arguably, how he viewed societal conflict and the need for this kind of hidden management of danger.
And then there was the influence of Leo Strauss. How did the work of the German-American political theorist, who was known for his writings on esoteric writing and the necessity of state secrecy, shape Thiel's thinking?
Strauss's thinking really provided the intellectual backbone for Palantir. Strauss argued that some truths are too complex or, potentially destabilizing for mass public consumption. Therefore, a governing elite possessing wisdom must sometimes maintain a degree of necessary state secrecy to ensure stability.
Okay, so if you view Palantir through that Straussian lens, its core mission isn't just data analysis.
Not at all. It's about building the technical infrastructure for the political and intellectual elite to safely collect, manage, and use sensitive information for the safety of the state. It's a deeply philosophical justification for what is, at the end of the day, a high-tech surveillance and defense company.
And we certainly see that aggressive intellectual posture in his 1995 book, The Diversity Myth, which he co-authored. It criticized political correctness and argued academic rigor was being diluted at Stanford.
That book drew major fire from established figures. Then Provost Condoleezza Rice dismissed it as demagoguery. But it's important to note the complexity and evolution of his views here. The book contains some highly controversial language about sexual assault.
Right.
In 2016, Thiel publicly apologized for specific statements he made in that book, which suggests that even a figure as entrenched in his own contrarian views can, at least on some subjects, recognize when an earlier position was overly aggressive or just plain wrong.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting and really controversial. We have to dive into his famous 2009 essay, The Education of a Libertarian. This crystallized his most radical anti-establishment ideas. He just bluntly stated, "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible."
That was a seismic statement at the time. He framed it as a statistical observation, arguing that the vast increase in welfare beneficiaries combined with the extension of the franchise, and he specifically mentioned the enfranchisement of women, had created a voting populace that was notoriously tough for libertarians.
So in his view, the modern system inherently favors policies like welfare spending that erode capitalist freedom.
That's the argument.
And that specific observation about women's voting patterns, that caused a massive immediate public controversy. So how did he navigate that political firestorm?
He later clarified, emphasizing that he was making a commonplace statistical observation about voting patterns that is often called the gender gap. And he stressed that the right to vote for women was neither under siege nor would removing it solve any problems. But the key takeaway from the entire essay, and this is the part that defines his subsequent business trajectory, was his advice to his fellow libertarians. He said, stop trying to radically alter the current U.S. government, which he saw as a dead end. Instead, focus on building things outside the political system.
Wait, hold on. If his core argument was that politics is broken and people should spend less time trying to fix it and more time building these parallel structures, Why did he announce in 2022 that he was leaving the Meta board specifically to focus on funding political candidates? Isn't that a direct reversal of his stated 2009 philosophy?
And that is the central paradox of Peter Thiel's political action. You've nailed it. He is the philosopher king who tried to move away from the messy business of politics, deciding instead to build his own world. But he eventually realized that the political world he was trying to escape was catching up to his creations. He's now engaged in a two-front war, building the future while funding the disruptors who will protect that future from the institutions he views as stagnant or oppressive.
That pivot perfectly sets the stage for his entry into the heart of Silicon Valley. Thiel's early professional life was this series of quick, almost restless pivots. It suggests he was searching for the optimal platform to deploy all this intellectual capital. We see him go from graduating Stanford Law to serving briefly as a law clerk, then spending under a year as a securities lawyer.
Then jumping to derivatives trading at Credit Suisse and even writing speeches for William Bennett, the former Secretary of Education.
It's a remarkably varied, almost chaotic resume for someone who values strategic focus so much.
It is, but he found his footing when he returned to California in 1996, determined to capitalize on the nascent dot-com boom. He raised $1 million for Thiel Capital Management to begin investing. It wasn't immediately successful, though. He had an early, painful failure, sinking $100,000 into a friend's doomed web-based calendar project.
That $100,000 failure probably taught him a crucial lesson about what not to invest in. The hyper-competitive, easily replicated software market. But shortly after, everything shifted with the creation of PayPal.
Correct. He co-founded the company in 1998 with Max Levchin and Luke Nosek. Initially, it was known as Confinity, or FieldLink, and the earliest funding included a foundational $35,000 from Thiel's own parents. The company launched in 1999, and its underlying purpose was profoundly libertarian.
Explain that libertarian core. How is a digital payment system a political project?
Thiel explicitly viewed PayPal's core mission as liberating people from the tyranny of government-controlled fiat currency. He wanted to give users more direct control over their currencies, protecting them from the inevitable erosion of value caused by government inflation or devaluation.
So it was a revolution framed as a protection mechanism.
Exactly. He famously wrote that a secure digital currency would make it nearly impossible for corrupt governments to steal wealth from their people through their old means. It was framed as the first true attempt at digital financial sovereignty.
The company, which of course merged with Elon Musk's X.com, expanded rapidly. It went public in February 2002 and then sold to eBay just 8 months later for $1.5 billion.
Thiel was the CEO up until the sale, and his personal stake was valued at about $55 million. But the financial payoff was almost secondary to the network he solidified. The group of executives and founders from that era became known as the PayPal Mafia, a term reflecting how that tight-knit group went on to co-found or fund major tech companies, defining the next generation of Silicon Valley leadership.
Following that successful exit, Thiel immediately jumped into high finance. He founded Clarion Capital, a global macro hedge fund, using $10 million of his PayPal profits.
This is fascinating because it shows him attempting to apply these big contrarian geopolitical theories to traditional finance.
And he had initial spectacular success. His strategy was based on these contrarian bets rooted in the peak oil theory, predicting a weakening U.S. dollar in 2003. He achieved a colossal 57.1% return in 2005.
But the volatility of traditional macro trading ultimately proved unsustainable, especially when you contrast it with the stability of a monopoly like PayPal. After reaching over $7 billion in assets under management by early 2008, the fund collapsed following the financial crisis. It missed the subsequent market rebound, and by 2011, assets had fallen to just $350 million, and two-thirds of that was his own personal money.
So he learned quickly that applying macro theories to finance was difficult, volatile, and that reinforced his pivot back to technology, where he could control the landscape. And that strategic decision brings us to his ultimate investment triumph: Facebook.
In August 2004, after a crucial meeting with a very young Mark Zuckerberg, Thiel made his legendary first outside investment in the company, which was then just the Facebook. He acquired a 10.2% stake for a mere $500,000, valuing the startup at just under $5 million.
The sources mention he bought Zuckerberg a car. That's such a strange detail for a $500,000 investment. What does that single action tell us about the relationship? Was he a mentor, an investor, or someone establishing immediate intellectual dominance?
It really speaks to the personal nature of his investments. It wasn't just a transaction, it was a patronage. Thiel often chooses to invest in people, not just ideas, and it establishes a clear hierarchy. Zuckerberg himself credited Thiel with providing key strategic guidance, particularly helping him time Facebook's Series D funding round just before the 2008 financial crisis hit. That secured capital when others couldn't get it.
And his influence allowed him to exit in a spectacular fashion.
Absolutely. When Facebook went public in May 2012, he sold 16.8 million shares, netting $638 million. And crucially, the moment the early investor lockup period ended that August, he sold almost all of his remaining stock for an additional $395.8 million. That's over $1 billion in total proceeds. He exited nearly at the peak.
He remained on the Meta board for another decade, but his announcement in February 2022 that he would not seek re-election was highly strategic.
It signaled a profound shift in focus. He specifically stated he was leaving after 17 years to dedicate his resources and time to supporting pro-Donald Trump candidates in the 2022 U.S. elections. The era of the philosopher king focused solely on building tech institutions was over. The new mission was funding the political disruptors to protect the technological world he had built.
That post-Facebook era marked the major strategic pivot for Founders Fund, the core venture capital firm he created back in 2005.
Okay, let's unpack the shift to hard tech because it's important. The sources emphasize that Founders Fund made a very conscious strategic decision to move away from easy consumer-facing social media. What they kind of dismissed as soft tech, like Twitter, they wanted to focus intensely on companies that would truly take civilization to the next level. They wanted technology with physical, tangible impact, not just network effects.
And this is where that Tolkien reference, the precious, becomes even more salient, right? They are guarding capital and influence that changes the physical world.
Exactly. This belief in hard tech led to massive investments in companies dealing with fundamental infrastructure. Think SpaceX, Stripe, Airbnb, and deep scientific fields like quantum computing, sequantum, Rigetti computing. It also included controversial but strategically vital ventures like Clearview AI, the facial recognition tech startup. It's about leveraging technology to solve problems that governments usually fail to address.
What's fascinating here is how this focus on foundational technology translates directly into national security. Our sources explicitly highlight his growing defense trilogy, a deliberate strategic concentration of investments in military and dual-use ventures.
This trilogy really defines his focus on American technological sovereignty. The first pillar is, of course, Palantir, which he incorporated in 2003 and serves as chairman of. The original idea was deeply Straussian, using data analysis to fight terrorism and security threats efficiently without resorting to the kind of illegal surveillance that would destabilize the state.
But that initial goal, it seems to contrast sharply with the controversies Palantir faces now. It suggests mission creep, or maybe a mission fulfillment that requires uncomfortable public scrutiny.
This raises a really important question about how technology shapes reality. While the software itself might not illegally collect data, critics argue its deployment enables mass surveillance. And more subtly, it molds the very culture of policing and governance. For instance, one professor, Vasilis Gallis, noted that when Palantir customized its Gotham platform into pull intel for the Danish police, it enforced a new ontology.
A new ontology.
Yeah. It wasn't just analyzing crime, it was structuring the police organization and defining policing practices themselves. The tool became the norm.
Okay, so moving to the second leg of the trilogy, Anduril Industries. This is the defense hardware startup founded in 2017 by his mentee Palmer Luckey, alongside other Palantir and Founders Fund alumni.
Founders Fund views Anduril as essential to modernizing the military-industrial complex. They provided their largest investment in history in June 2025, $1 billion, part of a $2.5 billion Series G round. Anduril is part of this growing consortium alongside companies like SpaceX and OpenAI that is challenging the sluggish, expensive, traditional defense contractors.
And their mission is to provide agile, AI-driven defense hardware, like border surveillance systems and tactical drones that can be developed and deployed rapidly.
Right. And the political dimension of Anduril is critical, isn't it?
It is.
The company attracted major political controversy in July 2025 when a Trump administration budget provision seemed to be custom-tailored to favor Anduril's specific border surveillance technology over established rivals. This just highlights the strategic duality of his empire. His companies are deeply integrated into government, while his political donations seek to ensure the success of those companies through favorable policies.
And now for the newest, third pillar, General Matter.
General Matter emerged from stealth in April 2025. It focuses on a very specific geopolitically vital substance, high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU. And we need to be clear about why this matters. HAU is not standard nuclear fuel. It is the specific next-generation fuel source required for small modular reactors, or SMRs, and advanced next-gen nuclear reactors.
So this isn't just a basic energy investment. This is a strategic infrastructure play for the future of energy.
Exactly. General Matter is building what will be the first privately developed U.S. uranium enrichment facility in Paducah. This directly addresses American dependence on Russia for HALEU, which is a major national security risk. And Thiel's personal involvement here is telling. He is on the company's board of directors, which is a rare occurrence for him these days. It indicates the immense strategic importance he places on securing U.S. nuclear and energy dominance.
Beyond this domestic defense focus, his financial ecosystem has this massive global reach through strategic partnerships. It almost acts as a soft power extension of his influence.
Absolutely. Look at the international venture firms he backs. Valar Ventures, co-founded in 2010, targets fintech in Europe and emerging markets companies like Wise in the UK, N26 in Germany, Kuda Bank in Nigeria. Then there's Crescendo Equity Partners, established in Seoul in 2012, which focuses on Asian mid-cap tech. They successfully transformed Korea's HPSP semiconductor firm, which some reports call Korea's ASML. These aren't just investments, they're attempts to secure supply chains and influence key technological infrastructure abroad.
And his space ventures outside of SpaceX, particularly Rivada Space Networks, they demonstrate how tightly coupled his investments are with political influence.
Rivada is a Bavarian satellite startup. The sources suggest its technology is more intrinsically suited for governmental and military use than, say, Starlink's current commercial standards. When the company faced immense regulatory and financial hurdles, Thiel's name was instrumental. His involvement helped attract high-profile political figures like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Jeb Bush, Karl Rove, to the company's advisory and fundraising efforts. His presence was key to securing over $16 billion in investment for this venture. It shows that high-profile political alignment is often necessary to get these massive governmental and military contracts.
Finally, we have to acknowledge Thiel Capital, his LA-based family office, which acts as the incubator and central hub for all these operations.
Thiel Capital, established in 2011, incubated Founders Fund, Mithril, Valar, the controversial Thiel Fellowship, and most recently, it has made notable investments in European dual-use ventures. For instance, the German drone startup Quantum Systems became Europe's first dual-use unicorn in May 2025, and they also backed the attack drone startup Stark. This just confirms that the convergence of venture capital, defense, and high-level national strategy is the overriding theme of his financial empire.
Shifting now from the business and defense empire to his political activism and personal controversies, we have to start with the infamous war on Gawker. This was maybe the clearest public display of leveraging immense financial power to achieve a deeply personal objective of revenge and, as he called it, deterrence.
It was a decade-long vendetta. The motivation, of course, stemmed from a 2007 Gawker article that publicly outed him. In 2016, Thiel confirmed he had funded multiple lawsuits against the company, ultimately spending $10 million in legal expenses, most notably backing Hulk Hogan's invasion of privacy suit.
And he explicitly referred to this funding as one of the greater philanthropic things that I've done. How did he justify spending a massive sum, $10 million, aimed at shutting down a media organization and calling it philanthropy?
His justification was that he was fighting back against Gawker for ruining people's lives, and he sought specific deterrence. He argued that the boundaries of journalism did not extend to violating privacy and destroying individuals' reputations. This move was a pure application of power to enforce a personal moral code.
And the result was absolute. Gawker lost a $140 million judgment and permanently closed.
It did. And what's truly fascinating is the unexpected coda to this story. Even Nick Denton, the former Gawker editor, admitted in 2025 that Thiel was right and did him a favor by forcing the sale of the company.
Moving to his broader political identity, we've established he's complex. He's been labeled everything from an Ayn Rand libertarian and a plutocratic reactionary to a democracy skeptic authoritarian. The one consistency, though, is his funding of the American right.
Absolutely. He is a consistent Republican donor. He supported early candidates like Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. But his financial influence reached its apex in the 2022 midterms, where he spent a staggering $32 million supporting his former associates and mentees, specifically J.D. Vance and Blake Masters. And both of them had strong anti-establishment platforms.
This raises a massive question about loyalty and strategy, especially when you look at the revelation that he became an FBI informant. Wait, if he is funding candidates who are actively campaigning to dismantle the FBI and attack its leadership, why is he simultaneously an informant for that very agency?
This is the height of the Thiel contradiction and maybe the best example of his strategic duality. In 2023, reports confirmed that Thiel became an FBI informant back in 2021 to help identify a foreign espionage network that was targeting tech leaders. The sources noted that he, Elon Musk, and David Sachs were targets of Russian intelligence, which necessitated his cooperation with the agency.
So he's an insider, protecting the technological elite and the national security apparatus by working with the FBI, while funding political disruption from the outside that publicly attacks that very same apparatus. What does that strategy achieve?
Well, it allows him to hedge his bets and maintain influence across the entire political spectrum, both the established functioning government, which needs him for counterintelligence, and the political insurgents, which needs him for funding and intellectual justification. He's protected whether the system stabilizes or whether it's fundamentally disrupted.
That tactical duality is also evident in his increasingly hawkish stance on international relations, specifically China.
Thiel has established himself as arguably the U.S.'s strongest anti-China tech hawk. He consistently views economic relations not through a prism of commerce, but through a critical geopolitical lens. Back in 2019, he called Google seemingly treasonous for its work in China, urging a government investigation. By 2025, he was pushing for a drastic reset in economic relations. This hawkishness is significantly shaping U.S. policy, so much so that one Brazilian paper actually labeled him the most dangerous non-state figure in the world today.
Finally, we must address the connection to Jeffrey Epstein, which drew enormous public attention.
Establishing the facts is key here, and we have to remain impartial in reporting them. The facts show that Epstein invested $40 million in Valar Ventures between 2015 and 2016. Emails confirm that Epstein arranged a meeting between Thiel and former Israeli PM Ehud Barak in 2014. Epstein also pitched an investment idea for a company to Valar, though Valar ultimately rejected that pitch as premature in 2016.
And did Thiel engage beyond that initial meeting?
Documents reviewed by the Wall Street Journal show about half a dozen scheduled meetings between 2014 and 2016. They were often mediated by his friend and fellow PayPal Mafia member, Reid Hoffman, who had introduced them after Thiel had previously rejected invitations. Thiel himself described Epstein as a crazed networker, which suggests he maintained this sort of transactional, professional, if slightly distasteful relationship.
Right.
While documents show Epstein invited Thiel to his private island in 2018, a spokesperson denied Thiel ever visited. Crucially, the analysis confirms there was no known major direct financial connection, but it highlights the disturbing fact that even figures as powerful as Thiel could be drawn into Epstein's networking orbit.
So if Thiel's political work is focused on securing the immediate national future, his philanthropic and long-term investment focus is on an almost science fiction future. He has dedicated significant resources and intellectual energy to the pursuit of longevity and even immortality.
He fundamentally views death not as a natural biological conclusion, but as a problem to be solved through technology. Since 2006, he's donated over $7 million to the Methuselah Mouse Prize Foundation for anti-aging research. And his commitment is deeply personal and extreme. He is registered for cryonic preservation with the Alcor Life Extension Foundation. He's wagering that future technology will be advanced enough to revive him after his legal death.
And this profound commitment has led to some of the most controversial and highly publicized research interests, specifically the Youngblood story.
What's fascinating here is his public discussion of parabiosis, the process of young blood transfusion. He noted its promising results in mice decades ago before it was, in his words, inexplicably dropped. A report in Inc. magazine suggested his family office, Thiel Capital, had contacted the transfusion startup Ambrosia. However, Ambrosia's founder later denied any direct contact from Thiel or Thiel Capital.
It sounds like this story took on a life of its own in the media.
It did. And one commentator later characterized this entire episode as a calculated, deliberate attempt by Thiel to portray himself as an evil genius in the public eye. And this is a crucial insight. He is not just an actor. He is a narrator. managing his own mythos to reinforce his contrarian persona and draw attention to his non-consensus ideas.
A more recent and highly visible venture that perfectly aligns with his distaste for regimentation is the funding of the enhanced games.
Thiel is the lead funder of this controversial multi-sport event that proposes to openly allow athletes to use performance-enhancing substances without drug testing. And the philosophical justification is profound. It views current anti-doping regulations as arbitrary governmental control that unnecessarily limits human potential.
So it's an explicit institutional challenge to the existing global sports order.
Completely. The organization is aggressively provocative. They're offering to cover the legal expenses of any clean athletes who participate and then get banned from traditional mainstream competitions.
His quest for autonomy is also expressed through his decades-long attempt to build new political structures, what he calls the Sovereignty Project.
That initiative began with seasteading, which he initially pledged $1.25 million toward. The utopian goal was to establish permanent autonomous ocean communities to experiment with different political systems, entirely removed from the confines of existing nation-states. But by 2017, he stepped away. He concluded that seasteads were not quite feasible from an engineering perspective and were still very far in the future.
So he shifted from the logistical difficulty of the sea to the political complexity of the land, focusing on charter cities.
Correct. He became the anchor backer of Pronomos Capital, a fund aiming to establish experimental, semi-autonomous cities on vacant lands, often secured through legal agreements with host countries. The most prominent example is Prospera in Honduras. This project successfully attracted nuclear and biotech startups, demonstrating his ability to draw rapid innovation to regulatory vacuums.
But didn't Prospera run directly into the very problem he sought to escape? Existing political sovereignty?
Precisely. It faced immediate legal struggles with the newly elected Honduran government in 2022, which sought to revoke the agreements. It highlights the inherent tension. Can technological efficiency and libertarian ideals truly circumvent the deeply entrenched power of democratic sovereignty? The answer, at least in the short term, seems to be no.
Beyond building new cities, he actively works to disrupt existing institutions, particularly through the highly controversial Thiel Fellowship.
This program offers up to $200,000 to young people under 23 to skip college and create their own ventures. He views this program as an act of external pressure, a reformation, designed to force the university system to adapt and address what he sees as its inefficiency, high cost, and most importantly, its lack of true innovation. It's a direct attack on institutional conformity.
This whole philosophy of focusing on unique creation and avoiding competition is perfectly articulated in his 2014 business manifesto 0 to 1, which he co-authored with Blake Masters.
The core thesis is that true progress comes from moving from 0 to 1, creating something entirely new and unique, like Palantir or PayPal were at the time, rather than competing in existing markets, which is moving from 1 to N. The book explicitly advocates for companies to strive for monopoly by creating a niche they completely dominate. It even advises them to avoid unnecessary public attention, which links back to the idea of the precious. The Atlantic called it possibly the best business book of its time because it so profoundly articulated the nature of 21st century technological capitalism.
Finally, we come back to the philosophical core that frames his entire worldview, his often discussed apocalyptic thinking. Our sources detail private, off-the-record lectures he gave in 2025 on the Antichrist, Armageddon, and the apocalypse.
And what's fascinating here is how he uses these religious concepts as political metaphors. He views a total one-world government as being closer to the Antichrist, the ultimate monolithic force of global conformity and control. He sees humanity facing the dual threats of the Antichrist and Armageddon, the collapse of civilization through global warfare or total centralization.
And he seeks salvation in the figure of the Catacon. We need to explain that concept clearly, as it's pretty essential to understanding his current mission.
The Catacon is a mysterious force in certain Christian theology, mentioned in the New Testament, that acts as a restraining power, delaying the onset of the final apocalyptic age. Thiel uses this concept to frame his own mission. He suggests that the work he funds, building the U.S. defense base, creating disruptive hard tech, challenging globalist institutions, is the necessary Catacon, the restraining force against the forces of centralization, the Antichrist, and collapse, Armageddon.
Commentators often interpret this complex religious narrative as a framework he uses to elevate his own role, or maybe just to justify radical action.
Professor Matthew Avery Sutton noted that while Thiel is certainly sincere in his intellectual pursuits, dressing political theories in apocalyptic terminology will raise anxieties, delegitimize compromise, and insinuate that democratic deliberation is spiritually suspect. It's an incredibly powerful ideological weapon aimed at legitimizing his radical actions outside established democratic norms. Hashtag outro.
So what does this all mean? Thiel's life and career illustrate a relentless drive, blending this profound, contrarian philosophical depth rooted in libertarianism, the insights of Girard, a kind of techno-eschatology with immense, strategically deployed financial power that targets the foundational architecture of civilization.
His money has fundamentally pivoted away from soft, consumer-facing tech and is almost exclusively channeled into hard tech that intersects deeply with national security and defense. He simultaneously funds and supports disruptive systems and individuals outside established institutions like the Fellowship, the Charter Cities, while maintaining a deep tactical influence over the most powerful political structures, from defense procurement contracts and intelligence agencies to major political donations that shift the national conversation.
The learner takeaway here for you is that Peter Thiel is a figure who understands that the future is not just stumbled upon, but actively willed into existence. Giuliano D'Ampoli suggested that Thiel's strategy represents the crucial alliance between the postmodern Silicon Valley and the archaic Trump, aiming to disrupt democracy by prioritizing technological efficiency and intellectual elite control over traditional democratic safeguards and institutions.
And this raises the ultimate question about his final legacy. Thiel is the champion of individualism and freedom from institutional regimentation. Yet his focus on securing strategic monopolies, as in 0 to 1, and building the technological infrastructure for centralized state power, like Palantir and General Matter, suggests a profound tension. He himself offered the perfect ideological equation. Crypto is libertarian and AI is communist.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought. Thiel's career is defined by building technologies that promise radical liberation, financial autonomy through PayPal, immortal life through cryonics, while simultaneously building tools designed for deep control, surveillance, and centralized power, like Palantir and the Defense Trilogy. His legacy will ultimately be determined by which of those two opposing forces, the libertarian promise of decentralized control or the communist threat of centralized power as he defined them, he ultimately empowered the most with his massive wealth and his immense self-willed influence.